Matthew 8:23 through 27. Jesus stills the storm. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us! We are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?"
This is the word of the Lord. I was told to introduce myself quick or reintroduce myself quick. I don't know if it's because I got a haircut or if it's because maybe you just don't know me. So I'm Chad's younger brother. I probably don't have to stress that. It's probably pretty obvious. And I'm a seminary student at Western Seminary here in Holland. So I have a year and a half left. Pray for me. Because school and I have never been the best of friends. So, I feel like I make that point every time I preach. But anyway, all that to say, I'm so glad to be here. I cannot, there's no right way to follow up last week. There's no right way to follow up a sermon about somebody relieving their dirt or emptying their bowels. There are only so many scriptures like that to preach out of. And Chad took it last week. So I didn't know what to do to follow that up. So I was like, let's just bring it back to Jesus, because I just don't know how to follow up what Chad did last week. Not that it was bad. Don't. He'll watch this. He'll know. It was great. But all that to say, when I preach, I love to preach about Jesus. It might seem cliche or simple, but it's just, there's nothing more exciting than Jesus. So with this story, I love stories. I made that very clear the first time I ever preached. You were all very gracious to me, because it was the first time I ever preached in my life. It was here. And I talked about stories and how much I love stories and how I went to college to study story. And this story especially, we need to look backwards before we move forward. In this story, we're only in Matthew chapter 8. Matthew himself hadn't even been called to be a disciple yet. Only 4 chapters earlier are the first disciples called. So you have Peter, Andrew, James, and John in Matthew 4 that are called, right? We have fishermen sitting in their boats, and this rabbi shows up and calls them. And sometimes people will read this and be like, "That's so crazy! What great faith! These guys just left everything behind to follow Jesus." But that's a huge honor for a rabbi to call you. And the fact that these guys were on their boats meant they hadn't been called. When you're not called by a rabbi, you go back to your family business, which these guys were doing. So they're back on their boats, and then out of nowhere, this rabbi comes and calls them. So of course they're going to leave everything they're doing and follow him. It's an honor to follow the rabbi. And the rabbi, their job is to teach their yoke, right? It's to teach, this is how I understand the Old Testament, this is how I understand God, and I'm going to teach it to you. We're going to talk about it, we're going to question it, we're going to fight about it, but we're going to love each other through the whole thing. Something I think they could, I think the whole church as a whole could learn from, right? You don't always have to agree, but you still love each other. And that's what Jesus was teaching these disciples. And that he does it right away. Right in Matthew 4, he calls the disciples, then he goes to the local synagogue and preaches and teaches. And then that's what the students do, is they sit there and they listen to their teacher teach. And then Jesus heals some people, which is crazy, but not that crazy. These guys know the Old Testament. They know God works through people. So after this, then we get Matthew 5, which, here we go, teaching. Matthew compiled a giant, series of sermons and put them into the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. And it's just here's all the information. That's basically what Jesus did. Here's everything I've got in this one giant sermon. And then when they're done teaching, right, it's we get a divorce, and we get salt and salt of the earth, and darkness and light. There's so many sermons in this one section of the Bible. And after all of this teaching, they come down the mountain, And the first thing Jesus does, like heals a leper, like touches this leper, and then heals him. Like that's a sermon for another day. And then Jesus heals the centurion's servant, like through faith. Like he doesn't see the servant, but he heals the servant because the centurion believes so much in God. And then this is one of my favorite parts of the Bible. They go to Peter's house, and Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and she gets up and starts serving them instantly. All right, like that's very like, if Jesus touched your life, right, when the first thing you do is like, I want to serve you, right? If you're ill and Jesus makes you well, like you're going to want to serve the person who made you well. But like I read it like a little more cynically. Like I read it like there's a bunch of guys hanging out and they don't really feel like making anything to eat. So he's like, hey, now you can serve me. I know that's not true, but that's just how like the first time I ever read that. I remember like when I was younger, I read that and I was like, that's hilarious. But that's not what it means. So just FYI. And then there's also the question of like Peter's mother-in-law. Like, so Peter was married? Like we never talk about this, and there's no mention of Peter's wife in the Bible. But I mean, he had a mother-in-law, so he must have like had a wife. But so like there are all these like crazy things happening, and Jesus is like healing people. There's just so much going on, and like at least these 4 disciples, and then some other people are just like, what in the world did we get ourselves into with this guy? Like we've got the craziest teacher of all the teachers. I mean, it's such a wild, like, can you imagine like putting yourself in their shoes and like Jesus is dropping all this information on you and then he's healing people on top of it. It's so intense. And then from there, Jesus like says like, hey, we're gonna get a boat and we're gonna sail across the Sea of Galilee. So you have a bunch of fishermen, so like they can obviously like acquire a boat. And on their way to the boat, you get a scribe who says to Jesus, like, where are you going? And then Jesus gives a typical Jesus answer where it's like, wait, what? And then you get a disciple who says, like, can I go bury my father? Because he just died. And Jesus gives another, like, Jesus-type answer where it's like, we have to dive into these, explore these, but it's like, right, let the dead bury their own dead. And we don't know where they go, what they choose to do. Like, we don't get that information. But after all of this, we finally get to the storm. Like they're on a boat, Jesus falls asleep, which I do not believe in any way, shape, or form that Jesus is sleeping through the storms of anybody's life. And if you ever hear somebody say that, they're not telling you the truth. Jesus, if anything, is exhausted from doing all of these things he's doing. And he falls asleep. I don't know like if you've ever done like a Bible study or if you've ever volunteered for like middle school youth group. Like you need a nap after that. Like you need a nap like after you preach. Like there's something about giving of yourself like spiritually that's exhausting. And Jesus has been doing this day after day after day. And he fell asleep on a boat. Like that's all there is to that. Like if anything, it's teaching us that Jesus like is human. Right? There's like we have the divinity of God, but then we also have like he's fully human while he's on earth. So he falls asleep and this storm comes up out of nowhere and the disciples freak out. Again, you have fishermen. These guys know how to handle a storm. I mean, it was their occupation. That's what they've grown up around. So I'm guessing like they have their like bucket brigade or whatever they have to do to sail through a storm. But this storm got so big that they wake Jesus up, right? And they cry like, Lord, save us. Like, we're going to die. And to be clear, Lord here, I know like seminary students love to throw out like Greek terms and Hebrew terms. I'm not that guy. I just know that Lord here means like they're speaking to somebody in authority over them. Like that's the word used in Greek. It's not like God save us. It's like master, like teacher, save us. Because they've done everything they can and they can't do anymore. And then Jesus, right, like here again, he says, right, like, oh, you have little faith. And I read that as like he's like really talking down to them. Like that's how I always saw that. But the more I look at this, it's like it's consistent through the Gospels that Jesus calls them like people of little faith. It's not an insult. It's like you just don't have the faith you need yet. It's coming. Like, I know the end of the story. It's coming. Like, you will have faith. So it's not this huge insult. Like, but at the same time, you have Jesus in Matthew 6 saying, like, don't worry. Like, God takes care of the birds of the air. He's going to take care of you. And then a couple chapters later, these guys are like, we're going to die. God's not taking care of us. And like, Jesus had to kind of be like, no. I mean, this happens over and over. This is what makes the Bible so fun. Like, Jesus is just consistently like, like, didn't I just tell you about this? And like, you still don't believe it? But anyway, all that to say, Jesus commands the storm to stop, and it stops. And the disciples are like, who is this man that commands the wind and the sea? But you have good Jewish, like, students on this boat. Like, they would have gone to school. They would have studied the Torah. They would have studied the Psalms. They would have sang the Psalms. And then there are certain passages where, like, in all of our lives, that they apply to us more than others, and it sticks with us. Like, there are certain things where it's like, oh, yeah, like, this one gets me, right? Like, I feel like this one was written for me. And there's a psalm that I have to believe that the disciples were thinking about when this all went down. Psalm 107, verse 23 starts out, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. Right, this is what the disciples had been doing before Jesus called them. Like, they're working the ships, and that's their job. And they saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven, they went down to the depths, their courage melted away in their calamity. They reeled and staggered like drunkards, and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Like, this has to be going through their minds. Like, who is this man? It's their teacher. But all of a sudden, their teacher just became the one who commands the storm. Like, wait a minute. Like, our teacher just did what the psalmist said only God can do. So I don't know if this is like their first, like, he's God moment. Like, I don't know. I don't know what was going on in their heads. But I do know that when we put this together, it had to be pretty clear that he wasn't just their rabbi. That there's something more going on here. And I think there are times in our lives where we need the teacher. Like, we need to be in this book. We need to, like, write on our hearts the things that Jesus said, the things that Jesus taught us. Because without this, like, we don't know how to fully serve God. So we take these teachings, we take these lessons, and we write them on our hearts so we can fully commit to serving and honoring God. That's fair. That's what this is for. Like, we can learn God's character and who God is when we open this book. But there are sometimes the storm is so big that you go through everything you've ever learned in here and you still have no idea how to get through it. And you cry out to God. That's what we're taught here. The psalmist says it, Matthew says it. Like, you can take all the things you've ever learned, but sometimes the waves are just crashing over, and there's no way you're going to stay afloat with everything you've ever learned. And all you can do is cry out to God. One of my best friends is a pretty devout atheist. I think if you're strong enough in your faith, you need to have atheist friends. I think it's very crucial to your faith. It's a constant test. You obviously love these people and they love you back. But like, my friend, I have a bunch of atheist friends, but like this one in particular, it's just a never-ending barrage of texts of, why do Christians believe this? Why do Christians think this? And I have to stay in this book. Like, I'm probably in this book more because of my atheist friends than I am because of seminary. I know, sad, but it's because, like, they're searching. They're always questioning. And it's like, why would a Christian act like this if you say, like, Jesus taught people to do this, and it's like, well, people are people, right? Like, we're sinful creatures, or maybe they were taught incorrectly, but it's this constant barrage of emails and texts. I don't know why people don't talk on the phone anymore, but it just seems like they don't. So it's just never ending. And I love it. Like, I got to be honest, I love it. Because I love these people, and I hope the best for them, right? Like, I hope that someday, like, they'll be like, you know what? Like, there's hope in this. Like, I get it. Like, grace seems like the coolest thing ever. I want a piece of that. So, like, obviously that's, like, the hope. But this past week, I got a text from one of my friends who, he left the state, so it's always, like, via, like, text and phone call, that was like, hey, can you pray for me? And it's like, what? Like that, I mean, that's just out of nowhere. And I'm like, yeah, like, I always pray for you. But I'll pray more specifically for you now. And his response was like, I'm extremely suicidal right now. And like, one, like, why are we doing this over text? And two, what do I do with that? Obviously, I text him back, like, if you're like a danger to yourself, like you need to get to like the hospital, you need to get somewhere like safe. But there's nothing that I've been taught that's going to get me through this situation. Like, this storm is too big for me to handle. And all I can do is cry out to God. And he might not believe in God, but his life's gotten so out of control that all he could do was cry out to somebody he knows who believes in God. And I think that's where we land in this story, is that storms rise up in everybody's life, right? I mean, like, there are seasons of storms, like, that we know of, right? Like, there's hurricane season down south. I, unfortunately, like, planned my honeymoon during that time, and it was the worst thing ever. Like, there are times we know storms are probably going to pop up. But a lot of times storms pop up in our life, and we have no idea that they're coming. And I refuse to pretend to know why these things happen. I don't pretend to understand why we don't get the results that we want when we cry out to God. If you tell me it's God's plan that, like, a 13-year-old boy was recently found, like, in a coma on his floor, I'm going to lose my mind. Like, I've heard, like, I mean, you probably know this story about this kid, right? Like, I mean, I'm reading, like, the social media feed of, like, this family that created this feed to pray for this kid, and you get people writing things like, well, this is all part of God's plan. You think that's what a parent needs to hear when their kid is laying in a hospital and he's not waking up? Like, that is not what people need to hear. When the storms come up, God gave people you. And God gave people me. We can come alongside people during their storms and love them through their storms. We don't have to try to explain away the storms. Like, it's our job to love people. Like, that's the greatest commandment, is to love people. So as difficult as it is to keep your mouth shut, sometimes the best thing you can do is to just be with people during these unbelievably difficult times. We're created in God's image for a reason. God chose us. So when things happen that are unforeseeable, when things happen that hurt so bad we don't know what to do, when the boat is sinking, when we cry out to God, God sends us to be with each other during these extremely difficult times. Right? And difficult times just happen. There's no way around it. Right? You get that phone call that's like, you know, your parent is gone. You get home and your spouse is left. You want to get into this college and you get rejected. You just want friends. Something that seems so simple and you just can't find them. You just feel alone. These storms happen consistently. Life is difficult. And God gave us each other to get through them, to suffer with each other, to be in pain with each other. So I challenge all of you today to cry out to God when the storm gets too big. Because what else can we do? And know that we have each other. And if you're in a time of calm right now, one, be grateful, but look around. Find out where the storms are in other people's lives. Enter into those storms and love these people through that time. Because that's what we're called to do. It's messy, it's difficult, it's inconvenient, it's uncomfortable. But nobody said following Jesus was easy. And the thing is, like, when we do this, there's no greater way to honor God than to be his hands and feet here. When we're like, we learn from the teacher, right? Like, we take everything we can from the teacher. But when this, it's gonna sound heretical. Like, when this isn't enough, it is enough. Like, it taught us to cry out to God. That's the lesson we take from this when the storm is too big. And that's the lesson we take when other people's storms are too big. That we enter into the storm and we suffer through it because God's with us through all of our storms, and he wants all of us to be with each other through it. That's the point of the community of believers, is that we can love each other through this stuff and we can be in pain with each other. It sounds like really depressing and sad, but it's so positive. If we can do this together, if we're called to live together and to support each other together, there's no greater gift than a friend who lays down his life for a friend, right? Jesus did that for us, and we can enter into people's lives and do that for each other. So find the storms if you're not in one. Love people through them. And if you're in a storm, don't be afraid to cry out to God. Don't be afraid to cry out to this church. Because God gave you this church for a reason. He gave you these people for a reason. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.